Before we get into today's story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time of day or night you're listening. We always like to see how far these stories travel. In the winter of 1883, 27 men set out into the rugged Bitterroot Range of northern Montana. Logging and fur trapping were booming, and the wilderness promised wealth to those willing to take the risk. Their camp, built near what we now call Blackwater Creek, was stocked with supplies and equipment, and these men knew how to survive in the frontier. The expedition leader Jeremiah Holcomb had been running ventures like this for over 15 years, always bringing his crews back safe. But that winter, something went terribly wrong. Only 9 men returned. 18 vanished without a trace. No bodies were ever found. No explanation ever agreed upon. The survivors chose silence, refusing to speak of those lost months in the forest. What we know comes only from scattered journals, old newspaper clippings, and the rare comments whispered years later when they thought no one was listening. The Montana Territorial Register officially blamed the disappearances on a rough winter and possible clashes with native tribes. Yet the records show the winter was mild, and the local Salish people had lived peacefully alongside trappers for decades. Clearly, something else happened in those woods. Something the survivors hid deliberately. This is the story of the Blackwater Creek hunting camp and the secret that has remained buried for nearly a century. Back in 1882, Mill Creek, Montana Territory was a small settlement, little more than a general store, a sawmill, 2 saloons, and scattered wooden houses. Surrounded by mountains, it was the kind of place where men came chasing lumber, furs, and sometimes gold. The town's population swelled in warmer months and thinned as winter closed in. But a few saw winter as their best chance, since furs were thickest and most valuable. Jeremiah Holcomb was one of them. At 53, he had spent most of his life in the territories. Born in Pennsylvania, he drifted west as a young man, first as a surveyor and then as an organizer of hunting and trapping expeditions. By 1882, his reputation was strong in Mill Creek and beyond. He was known as a strict, careful leader who returned with his men alive. That November, the Mill Creek Gazette carried his ad recruiting experienced trappers for a 3-month winter expedition with equal shares of profits. Store records show that 26 men were chosen, ranging in age from their early 20s to their late 40s. Some had worked with Holcomb before others came highly recommended. All of them trusted his name, his planning, and his promise of fortune. Among the men who signed on, some were seasoned trappers, while others were new to the Montana frontier. But they carried skills or resources that made them valuable to the venture. This expedition wasn't just about survival. It was a business aimed at harvesting prime winter furs and scouting land for logging crews who would arrive with spring thaw. On December 3, 1882, 27 men rolled out of Mill Creek in 8 wagons loaded heavy with supplies meant to last them until spring. Their names are preserved in territorial records: Jeremiah Holcomb, Augustus Reed, Samuel Perkins, Thomas Fletcher, William Norton, Benjamin Lewis, Charles Winston, Jacob Miller, Isaac Thompson, Frank Wilson, Daniel Roberts, Joseph Davis, Henry Adams, George Stewart, Edward Collins, Michael Williams, Robert Taylor, John Anderson, James Martin, David Brown, Richard Evans, Christopher Hughes, Paul Mitchell, Peter Schmidt, Frederick Cooper, Howard Griffin, and Eli Watson. 9 of those names would later return alive. The rest would vanish into silence. The route took 11 days. The party followed familiar trails, at first crossing the Clark Fork River, before turning north and west into country less marked on maps. The deeper they went, the harsher the land became. Towering pines and fir closed in on narrow valleys. Streams ran fast and icy, and steep ridges slowed their progress. Holcomb's journal describes a land growing emptier by the mile. No other travelers passed the fourth day, only the remains of forgotten trapper cabins and the occasional half-dug prospect hole where someone had once dreamed of striking gold. On December 14th, they reached a valley where three streams met, forming a single dark current Holcomb christened Blackwater Creek. The water, stained by tannins from the forest, gave the place its name. For practical purposes, it was an ideal site. Abundant freshwater game trails threading through the snow shelter from the winter winds and enough flat ground to build a sizable camp. Work began at once. Teams felled timber, cleared ground, and raised the first cabins. A journal entry from December 15th notes steady progress, fair weather, and the near completion of the first cabin by sundown. Within a week, 7 sturdy log cabins formed a rough circle around a larger hall that doubled as meeting space and mess quarters. A barrier of sharpened logs enclosed the camp not against human attack, but to deter bears, wolves, and to keep the pack animals from straying. Routine soon ruled life at Blackwater Creek. Holcomb divided the men into rotating assignments. Some ran trap lines, others hunted, others tended camp and livestock. His journals reveal his discipline, precise supply inventories, maps of trap lines fanning outward from camp, and daily notes on weather and game. For the first 5 weeks, everything went as planned. The men checked traps daily, hunting parties returned with deer, elk, and even moose, and the pelts began to pile high: beaver, fox, marten, and the prized river otter. The expedition had the look of success, at least for a time. Through early January of 1883, Holcomb's journal reads like the notes of a man overseeing a routine operation. He wrote about weather conditions, hunting tallies, and the occasional quarrel among men. On January 2nd, he mentioned breaking up an argument between Norton and Schmidt over a card game, but added that spirits were high and trap lines were producing well. There was no hint of the nightmare about to unfold. The men weren't entirely cut off. Holcomb had arranged a system where pelts would be hauled every few weeks to the nearest trading post, a 5-day ride to trade for fresh supplies and send word back to Mill Creek. The first such trip was set for late January, with Wilson and Evans chosen as couriers. They never left camp. The first troubling sign came on January 21st. Holcomb noted that Reed reported finding what appeared to be an abandoned camp on a ridge to the north. The site showed no trace of its occupants, only strange markings carved into nearby trees. Poor weather kept them from investigating further, but the unease lingered. Soon after, Reed began claiming he heard voices in the forest while on night watch. Holcomb dismissed it as fatigue and reassigned him to lighter camp duties. But Reed insisted the voices called him by name. Within days, others began hearing things too. Stewart and Brown reported faint whispering that seemed to follow them as they worked trap line sounds too clear to be the wind, yet never close enough to understand. Both men were regarded as level-headed and not prone to superstition. Holcomb responded by ordering all travel in groups of 3, but precautions weren't enough. On January 27th, Schmidt failed to return from his trap line. Searchers found his equipment untouched, but no trace of him. In the snow nearby, they noted odd tracks, barefoot perhaps, but not resembling any human or animal sign Holcomb recognized. The next day, Cooper disappeared while searching for Schmidt. Mitchell, who had been with him, said they separated briefly, and when he called out, Cooper never answered. By February, 3 men were gone. The camp's atmosphere began to crack. Holcomb's notes describe rising tension, sleeplessness, and nervous fits among the men. Night after night, they reported whispers drifting through the trees. Voices without words, impossible to pin to a source. Holcomb tried to reassure them it was the wind playing tricks through rock and timber, but even he began doubling the guard at night. On February 3rd, Mitchell stumbled back into camp a mile from where he'd last been seen, dazed and disoriented. He claimed he had followed voices that sounded familiar until he lost all sense of direction. When questioned, he muttered about a door in the cave before becoming so agitated they had to calm him with whiskey and laudanum. Holcomb noted Mitchell bore no injuries, only exhaustion and terror. From that point forward, the situation unraveled quickly. Men were disappearing without a struggle, without a sound, leaving behind only fear and questions. Whatever was stalking them in the forests of Blackwater Creek was now closing in. By early February, Holcomb's journals take a darker turn. His steady, detailed entries become scattered, his writing uneven and rushed. On February 5th, he noted Mitchell's death found cold in the morning, with no visible injuries, his face locked in a mask of terror. The men insisted on burying him beyond the camp perimeter, though the ground was frozen hard. It took 4 hours of hacking through ice and earth before Roberts could offer a brief prayer. Spirits sank lower than ever. That same day, Watson, Hughes, and Taylor failed to return from a hunting trip. Griffin and Anderson set out reluctantly to look for them before nightfall. None of the 5 were seen again. Holcomb's next notes reveal a camp shrinking fast. By midnight, 8 more men were gone. The survivors abandoned their cabins and huddled together inside the central hall as though being close to one another might keep them safe. Then comes silence. No journal entries for nearly 2 weeks. When Holcomb's writing resumes around February 18th, it is almost unrecognizable. His usually neat script runs uneven and hurried, sometimes marked only day or night. One entry simply reads, "They watch from between the trees. They are not what they appear to be." Another follows. 7 more gone. They went for water. The creek is 200 yards from camp. No struggle, no sound. One moment here, the next gone. We do not speak of it. We believe silence might protect us. The last entry, likely from late February, is chilling in its finality. We leave at first light. The 9 of us who remain. We burn what we cannot carry. We tell ourselves 10 days to Mill Creek if we move steady. We tell ourselves daylight is safe. We tell ourselves many things. What happened during those missing weeks remains a mystery. Later accounts from the survivors contradict one another, often breaking down into rambling or incoherence. The only other known record from that time is a fragment of a personal diary believed to belong to Benjamin Lewis, discovered among his belongings after their return. It contained only 3 entries. The first, the singing comes from beyond the ridge. Mitchell says it comes from the cave, but there is no cave. None of us are well. The second read says they are closer now, wearing the faces of our missing friends, like masks. He says he can see what lies behind the masks when they blink, but he will not tell us. Holcomb forbids us to speak of it. He says words give it power, but silence has not saved us either. The last line simply reads, "We are 19 now. Tomorrow there will be fewer." On March 12, 1883, the 9 survivors emerged from the forest. They did not come as a group. Reed and Miller stumbled into Mill Creek just after dawn. Winston and Thompson appeared at midday. Others followed one by one, until darkness fell with Holcomb the last to arrive. They were ragged and worn, showing signs of malnutrition, exhaustion, and exposure. But none bore injuries or frostbite severe enough to account for the loss of 18 men. The mystery of what happened to the Blackwater Creek expedition was never resolved, and those who survived chose silence over truth. Though the survivors emerged from the forest alive, their minds bore scars deeper than their bodies. The Mill Creek Gazette reported on March 14, 1883, that the men appeared greatly altered from when they had departed. They startled at the smallest sound, avoided direct eye contact, and spoke little. When questioned, their accounts varied so wildly it was impossible to separate truth from invention. Reed swore they had been scattered during a blizzard. Miller contradicted him, insisting there had been no blizzard at all, but rather an attack by some unknown mountain tribe. Winston and Thompson refused to speak. The rest gave versions so contradictory, so inconsistent with each other, and with the facts that authorities suspected deliberate concealment or madness. The territorial governor, alarmed by rumors of foul play, sent Sheriff James Blackwood, grandfather of Theodore Blackwood, who would later revisit the case to investigate. His report, preserved in the records, concludes that while the survivors' stories raised suspicion, there was no physical evidence of crime. The men appear traumatized rather than guilty, Blackwood wrote. I recommend medical care, not prosecution. Doctors who examined the group were baffled. Dr. Martin Whitaker noted that all 9 displayed an unnatural aversion to darkness, insisting on keeping lamps lit through the night. They reacted with disproportionate terror to certain sounds, wind moving through trees, the distant cry of animals. Several claimed to suffer identical nightmares of being lured into the woods by voices they recognized. Whitaker recommended continued observation. On March 20th, the governor ordered a recovery expedition led by Lewis and Fletcher. To the astonishment of all, the 2 men became disoriented in terrain they had navigated only weeks earlier. After 10 days of fruitless searching, the team returned empty-handed. The Gazette speculated, were the guides deliberately misleading the expedition to hide some horror? Or had they truly lost their bearings in familiar country? A larger expedition was mounted in June. This time, they found the burned remains of the camp charred timbers where the cabins had once stood, consistent with Holcomb's final journal entry about destroying what they could not carry. But no human remains, no personal items, no evidence of violence or disaster. The site looked abandoned in haste, but not in chaos. The fate of the missing men was no clearer. Yet one member of the recovery team, cartographer Alexander Reynolds, recorded a discovery the official report did not. In his private journal, he described stumbling upon a cave about a mile north of the camp, its entrance half hidden by fallen timber. Inside, the walls were covered in markings, unlike anything he recognized. Not tribal pictographs, not minor scrawls, not the result of natural forces. They were something else entirely. Inside the cave, Reynolds described walls covered in strange geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, as if the stone itself moved under the eye. 2 men swore they heard voices calling from its depths. Disturbed, the expedition leader ordered the entrance sealed. They packed the fissure with dynamite and collapsed the cave entirely. Whatever had been inside was buried. The 9 survivors never stayed together. After giving their contradictory testimonies, they scattered, leaving Montana behind. Records show Augustus Reed went west to Oregon, Samuel Perkins to California, and the others vanished into scattered corners of the country. None of them maintained contact with one another. Jeremiah Holcomb lingered briefly in Mill Creek before moving to Seattle by the end of 1883. His journal, carried from the forest, was given to the Territorial Archives under one condition: it was to remain sealed for 75 years after his death. Holcomb died by his own hand in 1885. His journal was not opened until 1960. The story might have faded into rumor and local legend, but 2 years later, it captured the attention of Theodore Blackwood, then a graduate student at the University of Washington. While researching frontier settlements, he stumbled across Holcomb's journal and became consumed by the mystery of Blackwater Creek. His research, still preserved in university archives, reveals a meticulous year-long investigation. He combed through county ledgers, newspaper archives, church registries, and letters tied to the survivors and their descendants. He even interviewed surviving family members. What he uncovered was disturbing. Martha Reed, granddaughter of Augustus, remembered her grandfather never sleeping in darkness, keeping rifles propped at every door and window, until the day he shot himself in 1884, barely a year after returning from the expedition. William Perkins, grandson of Samuel Perkins, spoke of family stories where his grandfather claimed to see dead acquaintances watching him from the corners of rooms, their faces wrong, as if masks were stretched too tight. Blackwood also discovered that of the 9 survivors, 7 died within 2 years of returning. Most were suicides, others deaths under circumstances hard to dismiss as coincidence. Reed's suicide came in October 1884. Perkins drowned in the Sacramento River in January 1885, though witnesses swore he was an excellent swimmer. Fletcher hanged himself in his barn in March 1884, with what the coroner described as an expression of extraordinary terror. Only Jacob Miller and Isaac Thompson lived long enough to see old age. Both withdrew from the world, living as recluses. Miller died in 1927 at the age of 76. Thompson outlasted them all, dying in 1931 at 82. Among his belongings, his son Edward discovered a sealed envelope marked, "To be burned unread upon my death." Edward hesitated, but eventually turned it over to Blackwood, who convinced him the contents carried historical weight. Inside was a confession. The document, dated January 3, 1930, began, "I am the last living witness to what happened at Blackwater Creek in the winter of 1883. As death approaches, I find the need to record the truth, though I have spent my life concealing it. Let this account serve as both confession and warning." Thompson wrote that the real trouble began not with Schmidt's disappearance, as Holcomb's journal suggested, but days earlier with something far more ominous. Thompson's final testimony begins with a correction. It was Reed who found the cave, he wrote, not an abandoned camp as Holcomb claimed. The entrance lay half hidden beneath fallen timber. Inside, Reed discovered markings carved into the stone walls, nothing like Indian signs, nothing like miners' etchings. They were older, stranger, and none of us could make sense of them. Curiosity got the better of them. 7 men followed Reed into the cave. Holcomb refused, saying he had traps to check. The deeper they went, the more markings they found. Fletcher, who had some schooling, said they weren't letters or symbols he knew, but they carried a mathematical precision, as if they'd been designed rather than carved. Roberts swore they shifted when viewed from different angles, sliding like shadows caught in motion. The tunnel opened into a chamber larger than their mess hall. At its center stood a perfect stone rectangle, like a door frame without a door. It rose from the floor unsupported, and through it one could see only the far wall of the cavern. Yet the air shimmered around it like heat rising from desert rock. Schmidt was the first to approach. He didn't touch the stone, only reached toward it, remarking on a cold draft that seemed to flow from the frame. Then he stepped to the side as if to pass around it. Instead, he stepped through it and vanished. No sound, no flash of light. One moment there, the next, gone. Panic seized the men. They bolted from the cave, breathless, recounting to Holcomb what they had seen. Most dismissed it as hysteria or a cruel joke. But Cooper and Mitchell insisted on returning, convinced Schmidt was hiding. They went back into the cave. Neither returned. Thompson's words grow darker from there. Over the following weeks, men continued to disappear, no longer in the cave which they had sealed with timber, but from camp itself. A man would step behind a cabin or wander briefly into the clearing and simply not return. No tracks, no struggle, nothing. Then came the voices. We began to hear them after the first week, Thompson wrote. Familiar voices calling from the woods, Schmidt's Coopers begging for help, pleading to be let inside. We held to discipline. No one answered, no one ventured out after dark. But the voices drew nearer each night. And each night they sounded less human. Worse still were the figures that began appearing at the tree line. Shapes resembling their lost companions, but off. Limbs too long or too stiff, movements not quite natural. Their faces remained blank even as they called out in tones of distress. And their eyes, when the firelight caught them, their eyes reflected not red like an animal's, but a deep, bottomless black. By February, the camp was fractured. Winston urged immediate retreat. Roberts insisted they owed it to their friends to recover them. Holcomb argued for patience, waiting until the weather eased. The split proved fatal. One morning, Roberts led his faction, 15 men in all, into the forest to search. We heard their screams all afternoon, Thompson wrote. Distant at first, then closer, then suddenly gone. By nightfall, none returned. But when darkness came, 17 figures stood at the edge of the firelight. Thompson's account ends with horror at the camp itself. Our missing companions stood at the forest's edge, he wrote. Roberts among them, all motionless, all watching, all wearing the same empty expression. The 9 men who would survive fled at first light. They carried only what they could grab, abandoning supplies and equipment. Thompson's words grow fragmented here, describing a frantic 10-day escape through the wilderness. We did not travel as a group, he admitted. That was our salvation. We scattered, each man following the sun and stars southeast toward Mill Creek. By day, the forest was merely forest. By night, he never finished the thought, only adding, they are not gone. They are never gone. They found a way through. They walk among us. They look like men, but they are not men, and they are spreading. His final warning was written like a curse. If you meet a man who casts no shadow at noon, who does not blink in strong wind, who speaks your name as though tasting it for the first time, run. Do not look back. Do not answer when he calls. What wears his skin is not a man. Theodore Blackwood, the graduate student who uncovered Thompson's confession in the 1960s, became convinced there was truth buried in the tale. His research notes show a growing obsession. He studied geological surveys to confirm cave systems in the Bitterroot Range. He interviewed elderly locals about folklore, describing the forest as a thin place where worlds crossed. He dug through registries searching for descendants of the 18 lost men and found none. No death certificates, no estates, no family lines. It was as though they had never existed outside Holcomb's roster. Blackwood's faculty advisor, Professor Lawrence Merritt, grew alarmed. In a letter to his department chair, Merritt warned that his student had abandoned all pretense of objectivity. Blackwood spoke of the Blackwater Creek mystery as though it were unfolding in real time, claimed to hear strange noises outside his apartment at night, and even carried a revolver loaded with what he called silver bullets. Merritt recommended a leave of absence. But before the university could act, Blackwood left Seattle for Montana. His last known communication was a postcard mailed June 7th, 1963, leaving tomorrow for the Bitterroot. Have coordinates for the camp. Will verify Thompson's account directly. If I do not return by July 1st, notify sheriff in Missoula. He never came back. 3 weeks later, searchers found his abandoned campsite. His notes and Thompson's confession were recovered intact. Blackwood himself was gone without a trace. The University of Washington declared him missing, presumed dead from a wilderness accident, and closed his case that September. His research was shelved, forgotten until 1968, when Professor Marion Leach uncovered the files while reorganizing departmental records. Leach picked up the trail. Unlike Blackwood, she avoided the field, instead combing through archives, newspapers, and local accounts. Her findings deepened the unease. Disappearances in the Bitterroot region stretched back generations. French trappers in the 1820s had called it la forêt qui prend, the forest that takes. Native traditions spoke of a thin place where boundaries between worlds thinned and things could cross over. And most chilling of all, Leach found evidence that the 9 survivors of 1883 may not have been the only ones to walk out of the woods that year. Between March and October, records mention 11 strangers appearing in scattered Montana settlements. Men with no past, no ties, who refused or could not explain their origins. Men remembered for strange habits and unnatural mannerisms. Leach gathered their names, but her notes stopped there. Among the 11 strangers, Leach identified the details grow stranger still. In April 1883, a man calling himself John Smith appeared in Helena. Police records describe him as speaking in a flat monotone and standing motionless for hours. Arrested for vagrancy, he escaped custody without explanation and was never seen again. That May, a Thomas Green set up as a barber in a small Montana town. Customers noted he blinked rarely and seemed to breathe only when speaking. By October, his shop stood abandoned, no trace of him remaining. In September 1883, a William Jones took a position teaching school near present-day Missoula. School records mention his uncanny stillness and his habit of silently watching the children. After parents complained of their children's nightmares, Jones vanished as well. The pattern was consistent: men who appeared suddenly integrated briefly into communities, displayed peculiar habits, then disappeared without a trace. Leach found similar cases in neighboring states over the following years, suggesting a slow dispersal from the Bitterroot wilderness. Her work culminated in a manuscript titled Echoes from Blackwater Displacement and Identity in Frontier Catastrophe. The university refused to publish it, citing methodological concerns. Leach resigned in 1969. She too vanished from public records soon afterward. The last item in the University of Washington's archive connected to the case is a letter dated July 1969 from Edward Thompson, son of survivor Isaac Thompson, to Professor Leach. "Your inquiry about my father's account has caused me great distress," he wrote. "I had hoped the document would remain unread. Now that its contents are known, I feel compelled to add one detail. In his final years, my father became convinced he was being watched. He installed locks on every door and refused to go out after sunset. The night before he died, he told me, 'They've found me at last. The ones who took Schmidt and the others, they wear their faces still, though it's been 50 years. I dismissed this as a dying man's rambling. Now, after reading your summary, I am less certain. Last week, I saw a man standing across the street from my home, motionless for hours, watching my house. When a neighbor approached him, he gave the name Peter Schmidt, the same name as one of the men who vanished in 1883. The neighbor thought nothing of it. I remembered my father's stories. I am leaving town tomorrow. Abandon this research." By the mid-20th century, the Blackwater Creek incident had faded into local legend. The area was absorbed into national forest land, its name erased from modern maps. The exact location of the camp and the cave Thompson described remain unknown. Yet scattered reports continue to surface. In 1922, an entire timber survey team vanished. In 1947, 3 hikers disappeared from a marked trail, their gear neatly arranged beside the path. In 1958, a family of 4 went missing, their vehicle left with a flat tire at a Forest Service turnout. Official records from the 1940s. Through the 1960s note, odd behavior in wildlife, birds falling silent. mid-song game animals abandoning their usual routes, predators avoiding certain areas entirely. Rangers frequently requested transfers, some reporting disembodied voices at dusk. Their accounts were dismissed as isolation and stress. In 1965, a government geological survey logged an obscure footnote about anomalous acoustic properties in Sector G7 of the Bitterroot. Sounds reflected unpredictably, creating the impression of voices where none existed. The report recommended further study. No such study was ever made. An internal memo from the U.S. Forest Service dated 1967 hints that the Blackwater mystery was far from dormant. It describes evidence of unauthorized digging in the restricted sector where the original camp was believed to stand. No permits had been issued for excavation, yet fresh earth and tool marks suggested someone had tried to reach the caves. Patrols were increased. No suspects were ever found. And so the question endures, what truly happened to the 18 men who vanished from the Blackwater Creek hunting camp in the winter of 1883. The official line, harsh weather possible clashes with native tribes, satisfies only the most superficial inquiry. The survivors' conflicting testimonies point not to a single shared memory, but to an active effort at concealment, whether deliberate or born of trauma. Thompson's account, though, written decades later, and likely shaped by guilt madness or both, aligns with local legends and a pattern of disappearances stretching well beyond 1883. Most disturbing of all is Thompson's implication that whatever the men encountered in that hidden chamber did not stay confined to the Bitterroot wilderness. "They look like men, but they are not men," he wrote. A warning, a delusion, or documentation of an infiltration still ongoing. One last document deepens the unease. In 1967, while reorganizing the Montana Historical Society archives, a staffer uncovered an uncatalogued letter, apparently written by Jeremiah Holcomb just before his suicide in 1885, addressed to the territorial governor, but never sent. It reads in part, "I write not to confess, but to warn. We brought something back with us, not in our hands or packs, but in our minds. A door once opened cannot be fully closed. They watch me now as I write these words. They wear familiar faces, Schmidt, Cooper, Roberts. They stand at the edges of my sight, patient and expectant. They know I will join them soon. But before I do know this, they are not confined to the forest any longer. They walk the streets of your towns. They sit in your churches and your council meetings. They may wear the faces of those you once knew. Trust nothing. Trust no one." The door stands open, and they continue to come through. At the time, the letter was filed away as the ravings of a man unraveling. But read alongside Thompson's confession, Blackwood's research, and Leach's findings, it feels less like madness and more like testimony. Then, in 1968, an incident occurred in Seattle that the official record barely acknowledges. Police arrested a disoriented man for disturbing the peace. He identified himself as Theodore Blackwood, the same Blackwood presumed dead in Montana 5 years earlier, yet insisted, "I am not Blackwood. Blackwood is gone." The officer's report notes his tattered but inexplicably clean clothing, his fixed, unblinking stare, and his habit of pausing mid-sentence as if listening to unseen speakers. Hospital records show he was committed for evaluation, then released after 3 days. He vanished immediately after. The University of Washington never heard from him again. No one claiming to be Theodore Blackwood ever returned to campus, and the man arrested that day left behind no trace but his name in a police log and a physician's note describing a patient who demonstrated no knowledge of Blackwood's academic work or personal history. When a journalist tracked down Blackwood's relatives in 1970, they said they had received no word from him since his disappearance in 1963. Yet over the following years, local papers in Seattle occasionally printed small, strange reports of sightings, a gaunt man in outdated clothing seen lingering outside the University of Washington Library, standing motionless for hours. In 1971, the Seattle Times ran a brief article titled, "Missing Professor Spotted Downtown," describing a man identifying himself as Theodore Blackwood. When campus security went to investigate, no one was there. The forest, however, remains. Blackwater Creek, renamed on modern maps, still flows through the wilderness, but the cave Thompson described has never been officially located. 27 men entered that wilderness in December 1882. Only 9 emerged. What became of the other 18 and what may have emerged in their place remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries of the American frontier. In 1972, Park Ranger David Corbin filed an incident report while patrolling what is now Lolo National Forest, the area believed to encompass the Blackwater Creek site. Corbin wrote of encountering an elderly man in outdated clothing at a remote trailhead. The man identified himself as Peter Schmidt and said he was waiting for my companions to return from their trap lines. When Corbin pointed out that trapping was not allowed in a national forest, the man smiled and said, "The forest has its own rules." As Corbin turned to radio for assistance, the man vanished. A search found no tracks leading away from the location. Corbin's report ended with a personal note. The subject's manner was deeply unsettling. His gaze unblinking, his voice a monotone, his skin appearing waxy or artificial under flashlight. Corbin requested permission to avoid solo patrols in that sector. Permission was granted, and he transferred to Yellowstone the following year. Similar reports have surfaced periodically ever since. In 1985, a hunting party claimed they saw men dressed like 19th century trappers standing motionless among the trees at dusk. When approached, the figures retreated into the forest with unnatural speed and coordination, spooking the hunters' horses. In 1994, a group of college students hiking off trail near sunset reported hearing voices calling from the woods. One student separated from the group and vanished for 2 days. Search and rescue found him disoriented, suffering from exposure with no memory of where he'd been. According to the incident report, he repeated a single phrase during his rescue. "They wear familiar faces, but they are not who they appear to be." Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery made in 2002 during construction of a new fire access road. In 2002, construction crews cutting a new fire access road through the Bitterroot backcountry uncovered the stone foundation of an old cabin 10 miles from the nearest documented 19th century settlement. Archaeologists dated it to the late 1800s. Among the charred debris, they found a single metal button stamped with the initials PS. Possibly Peter Schmidt, one of the trappers lost with Holcomb's party. The official report noted that the cabin appeared to have been deliberately burned from the inside. More than a century after the Blackwater Creek expedition, the Bitterroot Range has been mapped, its trees harvested and regrown, its wildlife tagged and tracked. Yet the place retains a reputation. Local guides warn visitors not to camp beside certain unmarked streams. Forest Service employees rotate out of the district faster than from comparable posts. And hikers still whisper about strange encounters, familiar voices calling from thickets. Shapes glimpsed between trees that seem almost, but not quite human. In 2013, documentary filmmaker Rachel Carter began developing a series on unsolved American mysteries. Her production notes show a careful professional investigation, interviews with local historians, combing through archives, scouting sites in the Lolo National Forest. On September 18th, she sent what would be her final email to her producer. "Think I've located the actual site of the Blackwater camp. Matches Holcomb's descriptions perfectly. Planning final scout tomorrow with local guide. If it checks out, we'll start filming next week." She never came back. Her rental car was found locked at a trailhead. Her camera equipment was gone. The guide she was to meet swore she never arrived. Searches lasted 2 weeks before snow closed the area. When they resumed in spring 2014, no trace of Carter was found. Then 3 months later, a video appeared on her professional YouTube channel. The footage, shaky and dim, shows dense forest at dusk. A woman's voice, presumably Carter's, narrates day 3 of solo search. "I think I found it." The camera pans across overgrown stone foundations. "These match the description in Holcomb's journal," she says. "There's something else here. Some kind of structure not on any of the maps." The image tilts toward a rocky outcropping with a dark opening. "This has to be the cave Thompson described," she whispers. The entrance was supposed to have been collapsed in 1883, but here it is. I'm going to take a quick look inside. From there, the footage becomes murky. The built-in light flickers over stone walls, marked with faint geometric carvings. "They're shifting when I look at them," the voice murmurs. The camera moves deeper. A rectangular stone structure appears freestanding like a doorway without a door. The narrator gasps. The camera drops to the floor, still recording. For 30 seconds, only audio, hurried footsteps, ragged, breathing a distant noise, like overlapping voices. Then silence. The video ends with 10 minutes of black screen. Audio analysis revealed faint noises throughout, footsteps, whispered phrases, distant vocalizations experts could not identify as human. In the final seconds, a single whispered sentence can be heard. Listeners disagree on what it says. Some insist it is Carter's voice. Others claim it sounds like a man. The most common interpretation. It's open again. The most common interpretation of the whispered phrase at the end of Rachel Carter's video was, "They're wearing our faces now." YouTube removed the clip within 24 hours for disturbing content, but mirrored copies persist on internet archives. Law enforcement investigated the upload, but could not determine who had accessed Carter's account. Her case remains unsolved. What can be said with certainty is this: the 9 survivors of Blackwater Creek carried something out of the forest with them. If not an object, then a secret. Whether that secret was simply the trauma of watching their companions vanish to wilderness hazards, or something far more sinister, remains unknown. 27 men went into the Bitterroot in 1882. 9 came back. And in the years that followed, strangers appeared in settlements across the region. Men who looked like men, but who, according to witnesses, were subtly wrong in ways that defied explanation. In 2018, a hiker discovered a cairn-like stone arrangement deep within Lolo National Forest. Beneath its center stone was a corroded metal container holding a handwritten note on decaying paper. Most of the text was illegible from water damage, but several phrases were clear, found the cave again despite the collapse. They continue to come through, wear our faces but cannot perfectly mimic, must recognize them by their stillness, their fixed gaze. I do not trust even familiar faces in the forest. The note was signed TB. Possibly Theodore Blackwood, though handwriting analysis was inconclusive. The site lay about 15 miles from where Blackwood's abandoned campsite had been discovered in 1963. The Forest Service employee who first examined the note requested transfer the next week. In his exit interview, he offered no specifics only. Some things are better left unspoken. Interest in the Blackwater Creek incident has surged in recent years, fueled by paranormal researchers, internet sleuths, and conspiracy forums. Theories range from the mundane bear attacks, hidden tribal conflicts, to the fantastic alien abduction, interdimensional portals, parasitic possession. Most unsettling are the contemporary claims, echoing the original accounts. Voices calling from the trees, shapes moving, wrong men in outdated clothing standing motionless at the forest's edge. While many can be dismissed as hoaxes or misinterpretations, their consistency with the historical pattern raises disturbing questions. In 2021, a small team from the University of Montana's Anthropology Department conducted a limited archaeological survey in the area, believed to contain the Blackwater Creek campsite. Their preliminary report documented evidence of 19th century habitation, multiple cabin foundations, deliberate burning, but no human remains. The survey was cut short when several team members reported auditory hallucinations and overwhelming psychological distress. Dr. Rebecca Stern, the project's leader, elaborated later in an interview. It wasn't just the isolation. It wasn't just suggestion. The forest there feels like it's holding something back. We heard voices when there was no one else for miles. I don't know what's in those woods, but I know we were right to leave. Dr. Rebecca Stern's final interview was stark. Something about that location affected my team psychologically, she said. 3 experienced field researchers all reported the same symptoms, voices calling their names, flashes of movement at the edge of their vision, a profound and irrational dread. I've worked archaeological sites across North America for 20 years and never experienced anything like it. Her crew collected what they could, non-soil from the cabin foundations, fragments of burned wood, rusted metal, and stone from a nearby cave entrance. Under the microscope, the cave stone displayed the same shifting, angle-dependent patterns described in Thompson's confession and Blackwood's notes. 2 laboratory technicians later reported headaches and auditory hallucinations after prolonged exposure to the samples. The materials were sealed and placed in secure storage. Stern's request for a full investigation was denied. The official reason was budgetary constraints. Unofficially, colleagues whispered about phone calls from federal agencies warning administrators off. The forest keeps its secrets. The door once opened remains ajar. And somewhere in the dense woods of the Bitterroot Range, the echo of what happened at Blackwater Creek in the winter of 1883 continues to resonate. In 2022, a hiker resting at a remote stream crossing reported seeing a man in old-fashioned clothing standing motionless on the opposite bank. When approached, the man identified himself as Jeremiah Holcomb and said he was waiting for my men to return from their trapping lines. The hiker, unaware of the name's historical weight, mentioned it casually to a ranger. A follow-up search found no tracks, no evidence of another person. The incident was filed away as mistaken identity or a hoax, but the questions persist. What if the 18 men who vanished in 1883 never truly left the forest? What if whatever took their place continues to exist, wearing borrowed faces, mimicking human behavior, just closely enough to pass casual inspection? What if Thompson's warning? They look like men, but they are not men, was not the product of delusion, but of desperate truth. The Blackwater Creek incident offers no definitive answers, only disturbing possibilities. Perhaps the explanation is mundane, the psychological toll of isolation, the unreliability of old records, our tendency to see patterns in chaos. Or perhaps something genuinely inexplicable happened in those woods. Something still rippling outward through time, touching lives far removed from the original event. Perhaps the door Thompson described remains open, a passage between worlds, never fully closed. Listen carefully in the silence between heartbeats. Their voices might be calling your name. And if you hear them, if you feel yourself drawn toward the dense shadows between ancient trees, remember Thompson's final warning. If you encounter a man who does not cast a shadow at noon, who does not blink in strong wind, who speaks your name as though tasting it for the first time, run. Do not look back. Do not answer when he calls after you. What wears his skin is not a man at all. For the 27 men who entered the Montana wilderness in 1883, what began as a routine expedition ended in mystery and horror. Only 9 returned, forever changed. The others vanished into history, or perhaps into something far stranger. Their true fate remains unknown, their story a disturbing footnote in the chronicles of the American frontier. The forest remains. Blackwater Creek, though renamed, still flows. And somewhere in the dense woods of the Bitterroot Range, something watches and waits. Something that wears familiar faces. Something that calls with familiar voices. Something that came through a door that should never have been opened. 27 men went into the forest in 1883. Only 9 walked out. The others may be closer than you think.